Today we're going to be comparing the Fujifilm X-H2s against the Canon R6. These two cameras are both sold at the same sort of price point, and they offer a very similar set of features at a similar resolution. So what I want to do is compare what makes the Fujifilm stand out for me against the Canon and where the Canon's strengths lie. I want to kind of explain why there's been such a big gap. My first X-H2s that came from the factory had some dead or stuck pixels on the sensor. When I came to do the image review between the Canon and the Fujifilm in that case, there were some really big blue clusters of pixels that had kind of got stuck on at 100% in the blue channel, and some red pixels with the same issue. I returned the camera to Fujifilm, they were completely fine about it, but I had to wait for a replacement before I could do any kind of formalized testing. I also don't like testing new cameras on client jobs, because in the end I don't want to trust a new piece of kit that might have an issue like the dead pixels in the first version of this Fujifilm. Let's take a look at the images we got from my new replacement. I want to say a big thank you to my friend Adam Johnson and my friend Gareth Morton for helping me with this, either for being models in the photographs while I shoot them, or for shooting me if I'm the subject in the photograph. So let's take a look at Lightroom and we'll have a look and see exactly how these two cameras compare. Here we have a file from the Fujifilm X-H2s, and here we have essentially the same situation from the Canon R6. So this first image, you can instantly tell the Fujifilm has more in focus than the Canon. The background on the Canon is much more blurry. Even though both of these two lenses are 50mm equivalents, the Fujifilm is a 1.4 on a crop sensor, which is going to give you around about a 2.1 equivalent on full frame, and the Canon is shot at 1.2, which is about as shallow as you're going to get on any system, medium format or full frame. So what I want you to think about is, how much is that worth to you? Like, what will you put up with to retain that extra depth of field, that shallow depth of field, or is it even a benefit for you? Do you prefer having more in focus? Because I'm going to spoil this for you now, both of these cameras are incredible. Like, you are not going to be unhappy with either camera at any case. So we're going to hop over to the develop module now and have a look at the adjustments we made. We're just going to get a bit more space. I edit using the archetype process profiles. These are made to match digital files to the way that a scan would look like out of a film scanner. And if you look at the top right, you'll see the profile I'm using today is Portrait 800 +2, which means it's emulating Portrait 800 overexposed to get like slightly more saturated colors, and it's been scanned on a Fujifilm Frontier. Everything else is being done in the basic panel on the Fuji. If you look, we've made no exposure changes, we've boosted the contrast and highlights, slightly dropped the shadows and blacks just to give us a little bit more contrast in the image. But other than that, we've done very little to try and adjust the image. So let's see what it looks like before I've made any of the adjustments, and we'll compare afterwards. So before, the image looked like this, which again is quite bright. Now, I prefer this because the profile will reduce the exposure quite a lot. And in terms of the contrast, like, we're adding those shadows and blacks back in to try and correct that. So this is what it looks like after the changes. So we've reduced the color temperature, we've adjusted the tint because it had quite a strong magenta cast. And when we've made those changes, we get these really lovely smooth skin tones. I'm getting what I like to see out of this particular film stock, which is a little bit of a green cast in the shadows. You can see it a little bit under his chin, some like blue tones introduced in that shadow too to keep it looking cool. On the Canon, we had to do quite a lot more. So again, if we look at out of camera, the Canon also has like much warmer, more magenta cast. It's got this really crisp, over sharpened look, and the skin kind of loses a lot of its detail. So again, I've applied that profile, and I actually needed to add a little bit more exposure to the Canon because it darkened a little bit too far. And again, you can see that we've had to raise the highlights to put some more pop back in the skin. We've again dropped the shadows and the blacks to kind of keep that contrast similar to the Fuji. But the area you're going to see the most difference is down here in the HSL panel. I've had to make a lot of changes here. The Canon tends to have some issues with skin tones and greens. So if I turn this off, you can see that all of a sudden all the color drains from Adam's skin. We lose all that nice kind of color contrast in the background that I'm looking for to kind of match the film tones. And generally the image looks a little bit desaturated and the colors look a little bit drab. If I enable those corrections again, you can see that the skin comes back to looking lively again, but we do kind of have a little bit of an issue with it. Again, the background isn't showing some of those kind of more pronounced color casts that I'm kind of looking for to try and match those film scans. So the Fujifilm didn't need much doing to it from the beginning. I've literally not touched the HSL. I might reduce the magenta a little bit if I was being super picky, but frankly, I kind of like the way the skin looks here. It was a cold day. This is what Adam's skin looked like on the day. And the Canon, again, it got rid of some of that kind of pinkishness by normalizing the tones in the original image. It was super, super unsaturated. Like if you look at his skin here, it looks dead. But with adjustments, the Canon can look amazing. So to sum up on these two images, the Fuji looks kind of better with my basic corrections applied. The Canon need a lot more work to get to the same stage. I also wanted to mention something about detail. So if you look at the detail panel on the right over here, you can see that Adam's eye is pretty sharp on the Canon. Like it's really detailed, really defined. And I've actually got the sharpening turned off. Now, the reason I've done this is because the Fujifilm files do not sharpen correctly in Lightroom. So for the comparison I was doing here, when I exported these images, I applied sharpening on export and not in Lightroom. But the thing that I found was that I actually prefer the way the Canon looks with no sharpening. That 50mm 1.2 is so brutally sharp that it actually benefits from having the sharpness taken away and not added. So you may have a different preference. I'm going to show you what the difference is. If we turn this back to default sharpening in Lightroom, you can see just how detailed the 50mm 1.2 is. And if we compare that to the Fujifilm, again, get this back on the eye and increase the sharpening, you can tell that rather than sharpening the detail in the eye, it's almost sharpening the grain structure from the sensor. I've had this issue before with other Fujifilm cameras. It's not uncommon to have this problem. And the root of it, I believe, is in the way that Lightroom handles the Fujifilm X-H2s sensor. It has an unusual arrangement of colors, and as a result, sharpening can be a little bit more difficult on the RAWs. This is not a problem if you export and sharpen on export. It is a problem if you want to rely solely on the sharpening that's in Lightroom. Personally, I like the image without the sharpening anyway, but if you do need to have the sharpest possible image, the Canon might be a simpler option if you want to see the level of sharpening you're introducing and you don't want to just apply it on export. So again, we've got similar situations here. Now, I wanted to pick this example because this shows the difference between the two cameras when it comes to lens corrections. So on the Fujifilm, again, this image has got very basic adjustments. There's some color temperature changes. There's no HSL adjustments, and the lens correction adjustment is off, which means that any distortion that you'd see from this 33mm 1.4 LM, the lens on the Fujifilm, is not being corrected by Lightroom. This is exactly as the RAW file was recorded. On the Canon, you can tell from the image instantly that there is an absolutely huge difference in exposure between these two images. And I want to show you why. If I turn lens corrections on the Canon, it dramatically increases the amount of brightness in the corners. The 50mm 1.2 RF is a wonderful lens in lots of ways, but it vignettes really strongly. Now, whether this is a problem for you or not is entirely up to you, but for me, I prefer to have a little bit of the eye drawn with a little bit of vignette, and with the Canon it means you'll have to go through and adjust that slightly by hand. So apply the lens corrections and then bring the vignette down slightly just to kind of make sure that they more closely match. And again, we're seeing more from the Fujifilm that I mentioned in the previous example that I really like. We're seeing that green cast that comes in the shadows that's introduced by those amazing profiles from the archetype process. And if you look at this image, it's still there, that green cast is there, but there's just less nuance in it. You can see there's multiple tones of green. It gets more and less saturated at different luminance levels, whereas on the Canon, it's kind of homogenized. You get one kind of green tone, one level of brightness, and there isn't the same nuance in those tones. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up to you. There is actually a technique called single hue dominance that a lot of people apply to their images, where they kind of normalize the colors in the image to make it look more luxurious and appealing. Personally, I prefer to do that myself, and I wouldn't want the camera to do it for me. But again, that's a preference thing. The Canon is still amazing, it's just doing things differently to the Fuji. The Fuji is capturing all the differences in tones and giving you that information to work with, whereas the Canon is normalizing those tones to give you a kind of a more neutral starting point, and you're expected to work from there. Let's take a look at a different situation. So this is a shot of Adam against the wall again, and we're seeing very similar things that I mentioned in the previous image. Again, there's some nice green tones in the background. You can see there's like a smooth gradation to the edges, very, very smooth, very minimal vignetting, decent skin tones with all the skin detail captured, but not a lot of depth of field here because he's quite close to the wall. And when you compare that to Canon in the same situation, you can see instantly he stands out from the background, even though he stood so closely to it. This is not something that particularly bothers me. If I wanted more background blur in the image from the Fujifilm, I'd simply stand the subject a little bit further out from the background and take the shot again. This image is taken by Adam of me at the same time we're shooting the other images, and it's to show the difference in tones between the Fuji and the Canon. So again, this is the Canon and this is the Fujifilm, and I want you to pay attention to the color of my jacket. That jacket is supposed to be like a beige tan, and in the Canon it almost looks pink. Now, I didn't shoot these photographs because obviously Adam was taking the photograph, I'm in the shot, but what I will say is that they were a little bit more difficult to match in this circumstance than they were in the previous one. The Fuji just generally had more true to life colors, the midtones were brighter, you can see from the kind of jacket that the whole thing looks a lot more luminant, a lot brighter, and the Canon, things look a little bit more subdued and a little bit less kind of alive, if you like. Again, it's still beautiful, it's still a wonderful look, and I would not be unhappy delivering either of these images to a client, but personally I do prefer the look that I get from the Fujifilm in terms of color, although again, there is no beat in the Canon for the depth of field. This again is the 50mm shot at 1.2, and that background blur is lovely. It's really easy to separate your subject from the background, and it makes the background look interesting and a feature of the image, although you could criticize it slightly and say that it's kind of taking away your sense of context. I personally love the wide open look, and for me, the main decider between these two cameras and stills would be whether or not you really needed that wide open normal lens look that you get from a full frame sensor and a 35 or a 50mm 1.4 or 1.2. If you can manage having a slightly broader depth of field, slightly deeper depth of field, the Fujifilm still delivers, and the image has a really nice quality to the out of focus areas, but it's not like the Canon where it will just instantly separate your subject out from the background. If that's a look you want, the Fujifilm crop sensor cameras don't do that at a normal focal length, although you can use the 56mm 1.2, which is similar to an 85, and I'll be doing a comparison with that lens very shortly. So again, if you want to have a look at images from the 56 1.2, come back, I'll be doing another review on that soon. It's actually on this camera over here that's recording me as a B cam. I haven't used it yet, this is literally the first time it's been attached to the camera, so we'll see how that looks over the course of the next few weeks. This shot is of Adam in a very, very high contrast situation. We're going to go back to the grid view, and we're going to take these two images and we are going to compare them. So the image on the left is the Fujifilm and the image on the right is the Canon. And I want you to pay attention to the way these two images look. As I mentioned, the Canon image is going to be sharper. This is partially because of Lightroom, and partially because the 50mm 1.2 is super sharp. So even though the Fujifilm is a 26 megapixel sensor and the Canon is a 20 megapixel sensor, you can trust your eyes, the Canon does have significantly more sharp detail in it than the Fujifilm. This is not your eyes deceiving you. The 50mm 1.2 is just that sharp, and Lightroom is really efficient when it comes to sharpening the Canon files. As I said, I can get the Fujifilm to match the Canon in terms of sharpness on output, but inside of Lightroom, this is about as good as you're going to get for the Fujifilm. Anything you do with the sharpening panel is going to have some unwanted side effects, so just be careful with it. But look at the skin tones, especially around Adam's mustache. You can see the Canon has a bunch of pink tones that are over exaggerated. There's almost this kind of weird kind of breaking effect where you see there's a pink and then it kind of goes directly to a nearly white. Whereas in the Fujifilm, even though there isn't fine sharp detail, and like micro contrast in the skin, there is a smooth transition from the pinkish tones around his nose, it was a cold day, to the kind of smoother, most normal skin tones around his cheek and his ear. So when you're looking at the two, again, there is no arguing. The Canon has a shallower depth of field. The Fujifilm, to my eyes at least, has significantly nicer skin tones and generally more pleasing colour rendition. None of this is a criticism, because as I said, the Canon was my main camera, just kind of a bit of a spoiler. But out of the two, you're trading better colour in the Fujifilm for shallower depth of field and more detail in the Canon R6. So when you look through any images that we discussed today, bear in mind that is the trade-off. The Fujifilm will give you more pleasing skin tones, it will give you a colour palette that I prefer personally and you may prefer as well, and more nuance in your colours. The Canon will give you more homogeneous colours that generally start off in a good place, more detail and shallow depth of field with the right lenses. The lens on the right currently costs £2,500. The lens on the left currently costs £700. Now, whether or not it's worth it to spend the extra money on the 50mm 1.2 will be up to you. And I obviously did pay that. I bought my Canon 50mm 1.2, but I want you to think carefully about whether or not it's worth it for you. And if you are not specifically going to be shooting the Canon at 50mm 1.4 or 50mm 1.2, it may be worth looking at the Fujifilm, because this 33mm 1.4 lens that's on that camera is beautiful. The rendering is really pleasant. I love the lens, and we're going to have a look at some more examples in a little while. Whereas with the Canon, your main issue is that you have to spend as much as you did in the camera body on the lenses to get an appreciable difference. The Canon 50mm 1.8, for example, is not a great companion to the sensor, and it completely changes the equation that we're seeing here on detail. Now, I want to show you an example of that, so I'm not just talking, and we're going to have a look at these two images. So the image on the left that you're seeing right now is the Fujifilm, and the image on the right is the Canon R6 with the 50mm 1.8 RF. Now, there's a slight difference in framing because the subject moves slightly between the two shots, and actually the 33mm is quite wide. It's slightly wider than a 50 from the experience that I've had with it. But I want you to look at the detail. It feels like the tables are turned. Look at the index finger and the case of the phone. There is a significant increase in the sharpness of the Fujifilm over the Canon. So if your main aim is to have an affordable system with excellent colour that can give you roughly an equivalent of f2 depth of field on full frame, the Fujifilm is a stronger choice in my opinion. The Canon options out there are a little bit hamstrung, not because of the camera quality, but because of the price. A Canon R6 is £2,500 at the moment in the UK, and the 50mm 1.2 I've been doing the majority of these comparisons on has been about the same price for around about a year now. So the Canon kit will set you back by about £5,000, where the Fuji kit will set you back around about 3,000, 3,100, 3,200, somewhere in there. Is it worth the extra money to you? To kind of again compare apples to apples, to the best of each system, now the image on the right is the 50mm 1.2. Look at these two images. There is clearly a difference in sharpness and in contrast with the Canon. Now these are both shot at f2, so there's no depth of field difference. Any depth of field difference you're seeing is because of proximity to the subject. Like I said, the 33mm is quite wide for a 50 equivalent. The 50mm 1.8 is about dead in the money, and the 50mm 1.2 feels a little bit tighter for 50mm equivalent. So even though they say 50 on the lens, they're not always exactly the same field of view. But look at the two. Which do you prefer? Is the image on the right genuinely going to be worth an extra £2,000 over the price of the image on the left? The only equipment I have now for digital is Fujifilm, and you're looking at them. There's an X-H2s here with the 56mm 1.2 on it. I'm currently talking to you on an X-H2s with the 18mm 1.4 on it, and I have a 33mm 1.4 as my primary stills lens. Either camera will give you incredible quality photographs. We haven't touched at all today on the performance of the camera in general, but I also find the focus to be more accurate on the Fujifilm. I find that it didn't lose subjects as quickly when I was using eye detection autofocus, and I generally had a much less frustrating time using the Fujifilm, despite the fact that I've only had it for a matter of weeks, where I've had the Canons for 2 to 3 years and the EOS R before that. I prefer the Fujifilm, genuinely. I absolutely love the way the files look. I would like it if they released a lens that had equivalent depth of field of a 1.4 in full frame, but I'm willing to deal with that as a trade-off because everything else about this camera is exemplary. If you need a camera that is going to give you the minimum depth of field possible, the most shallow depth of field, with the most blown out background you can get, the Fujifilm isn't the right choice. But if you're looking for something with a balanced depth of field that has character and still retains a little bit of context with incredible color detail and reproduction, the Fujifilm might be the right choice for you. We're going to be doing a deeper dive into the Fujifilm system over the next few months. There are some really exciting features on the horizon for Fuji as well. They just recently announced a collaboration with Frame.io, which might not sound impressive right now, but I think it's going to revolutionize the way that most photographers manage their workflow. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comment section below and I'll try and address them as they come up. Feel free to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more like this. My content will come out more regularly going forward, I'm hoping, because now I have a working camera and obviously you know what my decision has been. If you were here for the Canon content, I'm sorry it's not going to be here, but if you want to learn more about workflow for Lightroom, about how to be a better stills photographer, about how to use your cameras for video, or just about technology in general, this is the channel for you. I look forward to seeing you guys soon. Goodbye.